Здравейте, колеги! Радвам се, че сме заедно в този зимен ден. В една ситуация, която е доста екстраординарна, ние все пак се събираме и говорим, макар и виртуално се срещаме. И се радвам, че може да осъществим тази среща тук в Нов Български университет на една изключително важна тема, на темата как бизнеса, академията и организациите могат да работят заедно за по-добро бъдеще. Тази идея възникна още през лятото, да поканим госпожа Муита тук на гости при нас. И за съжаление нямаме студенти в залата, но пък имаме възможност да направим тази виртуална среща и се надявам тя да бъде пълноценна и да ви бъде полезна, да даде някакво вдъхновение. Какво да кажа за госпожа Джейн Муита? Тя е доктор, лекар, медицинско лице по образование, но има изключително богат опит в областта на неправителствения сектор и помощта към хората, помощта към децата. И по-настоящем последните години е шеф на УНИЦЕФ за България, което е изключително висока позиция. И в тази нейна роля тя сега ще изнесе през нас на английски език своята лекция, след което имаме получени от вас, колеги, въпроси. Аз ще ги задам от ваше име и тя ще отговори. Надявам се да ви е интересно и благодаря, че ще сме заедно виртуално в следващите минути. Джейн, it's your turn. Welcome to New Bulgarian University.
Thank you so much, Justine, and thank you, Syria. Thank you, participants who are listening to me. I'm really proud to be sitting here. Many years after sitting in a lecture hall and talking to students, I was looking forward to talking to you in person. But unfortunately, because of COVID, we are not able to see each other face to face. But I know you are out there and you're listening. So I prepared a lecture to talk to you, and you chose a very interesting topic, the topic of business and society for a better future. What better things can we talk about today, especially when we are in the midst of a crisis, where we need to get together, students, business, us in development, us in the United Nations, individuals, children, young people, parents, to ensure that we have a better future for all of us. When I was preparing this lecture, I thought about what to talk to you about. And I organized it in a way that we can communicate on the issues that you identified in the title on the topic. And I selected to talk to you about, first of all, the organization that I work for, the United Nations Children's Fund. I will then move and talk a little about business and society. I will then talk about education and human capital, because in order to deliver development, we do need educated people, holistically educated, not just knowing how to do certain things in science, but being holistic, including behaviors. And then I'll look at Agenda 2030 for sustainable development, because that is the instrument that globally we can all, if we all deliver on it, we'll be able to accelerate development and especially leave no one behind, be inclusive while doing it. I will then focus on, finally, on business and children, because children are one of those parts of the society that may actually be left behind if we don't put extra effort. And I hope when I talk about that, I will also focus a little on Bulgaria itself, because we, coming from the United Nations, we tend to talk about global, and we never come to talk about the country. So I will talk about the country a little. Now, talking about the organization that I work for, the United Nations Children's Fund. It was created at a very terrible time, soon after the World War II, in 1946. Why was it created? Because there were children who were really suffering, a lot of them orphaned without any way, anybody to look after them. So it was an emergency, and we needed an organization that could get together and try to save children. But over time, this organization has become very different. It is looking at human rights for children all over the world, working using the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Currently, my organization works in 190 countries and territories. That is a whole lot of world, and that is a whole lot of children. And in doing so, we make sure that the rights of children are fulfilled in whichever situations they are in. We work together with government, we work together with partners, business, we work together with universities, we work together with lots of people to make sure that children's issues are considered in the midst of any developmental programming. So this has been what I've been doing for the last 21 years. And I'm very proud of the work of my organization in making children count and making children heard. Now, in Bulgaria, what do we do then? You know, I was talking about the 190 countries, which include Bulgaria, by the way. And in fact, in Bulgaria, we work specifically, because we focus on children, we work specifically by looking at the data and working with the government to say there are certain children who are not meeting their rights because of certain reasons. Let's take, for example, children with disabilities. Do we know how many they are? Do we know where they are? Do we know how to get them to services? So looking at that data, we conceptualized 4 program areas that we work in. One of them is about early childhood development and care. And if you think about the data of children in early childhood development, it is not so good. And we work with government to see, are the policies okay? Are the services there? What else can we do? So that's one area. The other area we work together is inclusive education. And inclusive education is so critical. And when I come to talking about sustainable development goals, you will see that inclusion is one of the critical ways in which we can make a better world and a better future and meet the essence of the topic that you picked up. The third area that we work on, which is critical, is on violence against children and access to justice. If you think about violence against children, it's one of the worst impact on children. It can happen anywhere. It can happen at home, it can happen in schools, it can happen in communities. And it happens a lot in the world, including in this environment. So we work to see how we can develop programs that make sure that children are protected, that they can achieve their potential, that we stop it from happening at all. And we provide the evidence that it actually exists so that we can communicate effectively, even with the public, to say it exists, because usually it's hidden. Access to justice. Children who come in contact with the law, sometimes they can be in contact with the law for different reasons, but they are children, and they need to be assisted because they will grow up, and we want them to grow up and develop their own potential. So we work with the system, the government, with partners to try and make sure that the legal system also responds to their needs. The fourth area that we work in is communication and looking at how we can advocate for issues related to children, parents, families, young people in the public space and in different other areas. These are exciting areas that we work in, and it needs partnerships. And one of the big partners that we work with, of course, is business. Business, and in the process that we are working with business, is not only looking at resources or funding, it's actually looking at purpose and cause, so that if we work together, we can deliver on results for children, and we call it business for results. Now, moving away from my organization, and I know as you listen to me, you may have questions, and I will answer them when we get to that level. I was thinking, when I was trying to think about how to define society, and I realized when you look at the literature, there are so many definitions of society. But in this case, I wanted a very broad definition that would allow us to fit ourselves in it. And in this case, I said that society is a group of individuals involved in persistent social interaction, typically subject to the same political authority, dominant culture, and experiences and expectations. So it is very broad. So we can find ourselves in that society. But however, society does not exist without some form of economy. Yeah? So businesses are important because without a form of economy, then society will not progress, society will not exist. However, businesses need to take care of society. And that is why we are talking about working with business for sustainability. Working for business, with business to deliver on sustainable development goals. So if you look at that definition of society, it then helps you to think, where do I as an individual come in order to deliver on some of the things that make society happy? Because all of us have to do it. It is not only a role of business, your institutions, but every individual should be able to do that. And more importantly, for those of you who are learning, because I know there are many others who are listening but are not in school, you will be the leaders of business tomorrow, in the future. So what behaviors will you take into the world of business or into the world of the future, which you will have developed now in order to deliver on inclusive and sustainable development? That's a question I leave to you, because you can only learn in the journey. You can learn the science, you can learn the art, but the behaviors you have to look at how to learn them, including looking at which people have portrayed those behaviors that are inclusive, that are visionary, that are good to deliver on sustainable development. Now, what is the role of education in all this then, having come from there? Of course, education is very important and a critical element in society, especially now that we know modern education, and we know that when you learn, you become a different kind of individual, but you exist in a society and you can mold that society because you have been educated in a certain way. You are lucky today. I was thinking as I was preparing this topic, and I thought about myself going through the same education that you're going through. In my time, there was no World Wide Web. And guess what? We did a lot of research, and we did it in the libraries, in the dust, with the big books. And the first time we got a CD-ROM that put a lot of literature together, we were celebrating. Now you, with a click of your thumb, you can find so much information. So what you should be doing is actually learning and looking at who are those leaders that you like to emulate that actually deliver on sustainable development goals, for example. Who are those kinds of leaders that include everybody else? Who are those leaders that actually bring in change in society that is positive? But also, education is important because it brings prosperity. Because educated people then innovate, educated people develop new and modern ways of thinking. So education is really an important component in society. And it brings me to looking at how then do we build human capital? Because that human capital will deliver for society, the economy, and the good things that you make society enjoy the future. But human capacity needs to be developed very, very early in life. And that is why I said in our own programming as UNICEF, we think about developing human capacity from early childhood. Because when you start learning, when you talk about education, it's just not what you learned when you are in school. There's a lot of learning that happens at home with the parents. And if the parents are educated or they have gone through certain experiences that are positive, they impart them on their children from early childhood. Things like discrimination, things like selecting people because they have different abilities are learned very early. And of course in schools, when we are in lower grades, when we don't want to sit next to somebody because our parents said they were different, these are things that we learn as we go on. But when we get to the age that you are now in university, you have a choice to make. And you have things to see that make you change. The only and most important thing is, even as you build your capacity, and the World Bank has defined the Human Capacity Index. It is an index that looks at health and education, and we need to invest in both good health and education in order to develop the capacity of the human for them to deliver on the economy, to deliver on developing the nation, and even existing in society. So human capital is one of the areas that institutions put a lot of effort in their delivery. But when I was looking at this role of education and education institutions, I also thought that there is so much that we could do. We need to learn from before, because there is already knowledge that exists. We can't throw it away. It is important knowledge that must come to inform the future. Institutions also need to introduce new knowledge. They need to be able to help the learners analyze previous knowledge, bring new knowledge so that it's quite comprehensive. Institutions need to also innovate, to help learners to innovate. Because we are at the period when innovation is what is going to drive a lot of change that happens in our future. And I'm telling you, innovations happen everywhere. They happen in every sphere. You can't say that I'm only in science or I'm in this area or the other area. Innovations can happen anywhere. But finally, education institutions must also work towards education for sustainable development. What do I mean? It must encourage changes in knowledge and skills, values and attitudes to enable a more sustainable and equitable society. So apart from learning all this other knowledge, innovating, making the person holistic enough that they can think about others, not about just individual. Think about the whole society. So this is also the role of institutions. Now, I come to my beloved subject, Sustainable Development Goals. When I think about Sustainable Development Goals, I've lived through, like I said, 21 years of working for the United Nations, so I'm converted in terms of human rights, making sure that societies are inclusive. And I know a lot of people ask a lot of questions. Why do we develop some goals that look so far away from us? They are global. But before we get to developing any goals, we look, the United Nations being a state party, owned by all these state parties. They have all the evidence in the world to see what is happening in different areas, and by the time they determine what can change the world, it has gone through a lot of research experiences and coming up with very specific targets. And in this case, in 2015, the 17 goals were determined. These 17 goals cover different areas, but most importantly, they look at people, us, the people. They look at people with prosperity, moving forward, being economically able, not just people as people, but people with prosperity. But they don't forget that you can't sit as people without thinking about where we are standing on this planet. If we don't think about the planet and protect it and look at all the ways we can make sure it survives, then people and prosperity will not be there. So the 17 goals actually address all this, and they are very interlinked. And you will see, when I set out the presentation that you will see later, that they not only came up with the goals, but they went further to say, well, if we have these goals and we have to deliver by 2030, quite a long time, so what are our targets? What are our milestones? How shall we know we are getting there? So they are targets. And because there are 17 goals, they ended up with 169 targets. And when you map out those targets, you see they are all interlinked. They even went further to look at the indicators. And the indicators are even more. For those of us who look at a few indicators and be very smart, we were complaining these are too many. But everybody wants to see themselves in these indicators, and they ended up being 230. But 230 is not many. We are talking about the world, 7.7 billion people. It is not that big. So really, if they are interconnected, if we deliver all of them and leave no one behind, the 7.7 billion people, we would achieve prosperity. We would remain with a planet that looks really good, and we would have people. So these goals, really, the Sustainable Development Goals, belong to all of us. They just don't belong to the United Nations or the state parties that actually signed to them. And it is not correct to ask, when is the government going to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals? No. I should ask myself, how am I contributing to the delivery of sustainable goals on behalf of Bulgaria? Because each of us has a role to play. How is business doing it? How is the NGO sector doing it? And if we do that, then, because it's a very ambitious plan, we will end up achieving, in totality, Sustainable Development Goals without leaving anyone behind. So you will see that 230 indicators are not so many. Sometimes we even fail to be able to report on them because we are not focusing on the specific area that is mine. For example, if I'm working in the education sector, I should be able in my mind to have which is that goal that I'm focused on, what are the indicators, and are we getting there for those indicators? But on the side of business, really, business has a major role to play, and they are part and parcel of delivering the Sustainable Development Goals. It is said to be one of the ways to actually transform business achievement. Because then, and you will see, this week, next week, I think it's on the 11th at about 4 p.m., we will be bringing a talk to business from one very important motivational speaker. Why? Because we want to be guiding business as UNICEF on thinking about purpose-driven businesses. Because when you come up with a purpose that indicates looking at sustainability, businesses do much better. And if that happens, then we will be able to achieve sustainable goals, which is one of the promises that also businesses have made in accepting to be part of the process of its delivery. But what would be their benefit if they delivered on Sustainable Development Goals? They would be trusted. There would be an increased trust from stakeholders. They would be better to, it will be easier for them to cover their own licensing because they are reporting that, there are reports that they are supposed to be reporting on. They would also improve their reputation. They will build resilience in the populations that they work with. And of course, most importantly, they would stabilize society. And once you stabilize society, the markets improve. And if the markets improve, business does better. So it is really a win-win situation. Where are we in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals? If you think backwards, you'd think that from 2012, when the decisions were made at that time on the future we want, it was very clear that people they were thinking very far behind, and that future they were looking at was a future that was really exciting. They developed the goals and launched them in 2016. But before they did that, they also came up with the Paris climate meeting, which also looked at how we were going to protect the planet and set how we would reduce the carbon footprint. This was critical because before you even come up with the 17 goals, you have to address where the world, you want the people, where you want to have the planet going, and then finally come up with the specific goals that you want. And here in Bulgaria, luckily, immediately after the launch of the 17 goals, the Global Compact, the local network, actually came up with a plan on how business would participate in this process. And this action plan was live, and it could be implemented and followed up. So I know that this country was actually on the forefront of moving the agenda forward. And more recently, this year, the government of Bulgaria has presented its voluntary national review. The voluntary national review, as it states, it's voluntary. So you actually report voluntarily where you are at on the delivery on SDGs. And this is important. Why? Because it helps you to look back and say, yourself, voluntarily, how have you performed? And where do you need to go? What is it that you need to do? Because the decade that we are starting now, from 2020, is the decade to accelerate. It's the decade to take action. In fact, it is called the decade of action to deliver on sustainable development goals. It's a very short time. We've already done the 5 years. So now we need the 10 years to be really accelerated. And this is the time that each one of us would be able to participate and make sure that that happens. But what about business in Bulgaria? I understand that in 2018, there was a study that was done on CSR in Bulgaria, a national survey. And it showed that Bulgaria business is also doing some work in terms of getting to sustainable development goals. And about 62% mentioned that they mentioned about global goals in their strategies. That is good, because it means they were already considering. So 62% is a good number. 55% had organized one or more events on the topic of sustainable development goals. I think if we do another survey now, 2 years later, maybe we have reached 80%. And I challenge the people who did it in 2018, they could repeat it, and we see how that happens. I know that Marina Stefanova was the one who did it, and she could be listening, so she can repeat and see how the change has happened, because we have put some investment in terms of getting business to think more about sustainable goals. We have done some trainings, especially we as UNICEF. We have partnered with FEBA to do an academy where we can talk about sustainable development goals, business and child rights, look at shared value partnerships with business that deliver on results. So there must be some change, and we will try to follow up on that. Further to that, we also, as UNICEF, did a survey to try and look at a corporate social responsibility of business in Bulgaria. And we were trying to look at how we can align it with some of the deliverables for children, on children's related sustainable development goals. And it was very interesting because we looked at 536 corporate social responsibility practices. And we found, and it was they are all happening in 27 territories in Bulgaria. We found that about 56% of these partnerships were happening, there were multiple partnerships that were happening, and that 87% were several editions, maybe this year, next year, and the other year. And what we found most interestingly is that all this, majority of the corporate social responsibility investments by business in Bulgaria happens for Sustainable Development Goal 4. This is on quality education. Sustainable Development Goal 4. That is 63% of the 536. The one that followed was Goal 3, and this is on health. So you can see that the investments are going towards some of the areas that would help us even build good human capital. So it is in Bulgarian CSR practices of business are focused on sustainable development goals. Of course, the others are smaller numbers, but they also targeted Goal 1 on no poverty. They targeted Goal 15 on life on land, and Goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. But of course, we didn't do a lot of analysis for the other goals. We were looking at the ones that really focused on children. So there is some work that is happening, but we are saying we can still do better. The other thing that I wanted to share with you is that my organization, UNICEF, works for children, as I said, and we work in partnership with government, with NGOs, with individuals, with parents. When we work with business, for many years, even globally, we worked a lot, first of all, to fundraise, because as you understand, UNICEF is a fund, so we fundraise all the resources that we use to deliver on the results from individuals, from corporates, from foundations. And so fundraising is one of the things that we do with corporates. But we have developed a new way of working with business. And it is a new model. And this model, we are calling it shared value partnerships. And the way we define it is that it is partnerships that achieve social impact at scale and deliver strategic economic value for business. So that we are achieving on one side for children, and business is achieving its value. So it is a win-win. But in this case, we don't only focus on their funding. We focus on business because they have so many assets that can be used in order to deliver on children's results. They could be technical. They could be their innovative nature. They could be their volunteer nature. It could be unlocking their supply chains. And these are very important because we have used those kinds of experiences where we co-create to change an environment for children. Say, for example, in water, in access to water for populations in some parts of Africa where there's no water. And we have worked with businesses to change those kinds of things. Not necessarily to get money, but to come up with solutions that business manages to deliver on their own issues, but we also deliver together for sustainability. Now, when I have been talking like this, I've just been thinking, maybe it's time to ask some questions to you. Because finally, when we deliver on sustainable development goals, you may ask a lot of questions to me. But I would like to leave you with a few questions for yourselves. And one of those questions, which is very important, is that you, as the current young people, and you are the future business leaders in different fields, are you inquisitive enough? Because there are so many opportunities for learning and developing in a holistic manner. So are you inquisitive enough? Ask yourself that question. And when you are inquisitive, do you look at what is real and what is fake? As a future leader, that is the other question. How are you learning or modeling or cultivating your own leadership characteristics in order to be inclusive, to inspire vision? And I would like to tell you that leaders who have vision, who are inclusive, exist today, or they existed somewhere in the recent past. And you can learn from them some of those characteristics. Then the other question that I would like to ask, are businesses engaging learning institutions and partnering to benefit society? If not, how can we reach out? What are the missed opportunities that we may want to make sure that we are not missing? So this is as much as I wanted to talk to you about. I know it is a lot to cover in a very short time, but I hope that when I circulate my prepared presentation, you will have some questions for me, and I can always answer. I'm available in Bulgaria. I'm the representative, and I'm not leaving soon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Justine.
Yeah. Thank you, Jane, for this lecture. It was really inspiring, and it covers so many topics. But however, I have also questions for you from our colleagues from the university and also from the students.
Okay.
So, are you ready?
Yes, yes.
Some more minutes.
Let me see whether I'm ready. Yes, I should be ready.
Okay. Then first question comes from our colleague, teacher here at the university, Ivan Christov. He says, sometimes global goals of the United Nations look too big and far away from us, ordinary people. What are the small steps in our everyday life toward achieving them?
That is a very good question, Justine. And I'd really like to thank Ivan, because it's a question that is asked a lot. But let me just sit back and ask you some questions, and then I'll try to answer. Is it not true that when we think about the planet, we are all engaging the planet in different ways? For example, because I said that the Sustainable Development Goals are about people, they're about planet, and then they're about the economy. The reason I asked that is, to protect the planet, for example, in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to think about reducing our carbon emissions. So there are certain things that each one of us can do. There are certain things that we can do to save the environment. For example, even the use of plastics. Many times I go to the supermarket myself, and on one side there's a plastic bag, and on the other side there is a paper bag. The plastic bag is always a nicer item to use, but the one that would be saving the planet is the other paper. So just making that choice helps you to take that one small step in order to save the planet. Maybe even switching off the lights. Maybe even doing certain things, recycling, for example. So that is only on one of the goals. But think about some of the things that we could do to make inclusion, for example. Isn't that something that we can do as individuals? Even just talking to other people to tell them, being the change that we want to be. So as individuals, if you look at each and every goal, there is something that each one of us can do, even as an individual. There are things that we can do as a family. There are things that we can do as a community. There are things that we can do as an institution. But just like that story, if you remember the story of the little boy at the seaside, where there were so many shellfish that had been washed onto the sea, and he was picking one and sending it back into the sea. The father thought he was wasting his time, but the answer that this boy gave to the father was, at least I saved that one. So if you recycle, you are contributing to a reduction. It could be in the point something, but it is something. So there are different ways we can contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, each one of us, little by little.
Yeah, I believe in this myself too.
Okay.
Thank you for answering, Ivan. Okay. I believe he's happy with the answer. The next question comes from Maria Peklivanova. She's our student. For yourself, what did the change in the last years regarding the UN Global Goals? I mean, you were witnessing all this process all these years.
Yes.
So a long path, maybe, long way.
Okay. All right. Maria, thank you for that question. You see, from where I sit as a UNICEF representative, I see a lot in the world that is changing, and I see a lot that is happening. Most importantly, what I can say that I have seen change is many more people thinking about the world, thinking about our planet, thinking about each other, thinking about human rights. It doesn't matter in which direction they are talking about them, because when you start talking about them, you read about them and you get convinced. So one of the changes that I can talk about is that knowledge is becoming important about sustainable development goals. Who is being left behind? Who is not benefiting from the development that we want to happen? These are some of the changes that I must say. But for children and for indicators that have changed, we can say a lot has changed. For example, over the many years, we were not able to reduce under 5 mortality. But if you look at the last decades, and even in the last few years, the other 5 mortality is going down everywhere. It may not be going as fast as we want it to go, but there are changes that are occurring. Also in education, if you look at global data, there are changes. But what is important is for us to break that and say, this change is global, but what about this community down here? Has it changed for them? What about thinking about children with disability? Has it changed for them? That is where I feel we still have a lot of work to do. But in terms of general indicators, there's a lot of change. There's a lot of change that has occurred. But in order to include everybody else, in order to achieve on some of the areas that are not moving fast enough, for example, on the climate side, that is why we have a decade of action to do it. We pull up our sleeves, even our socks, and we move.
Thank you. And then another question, as we don't have much time, I will reduce some of the questions. Okay. But Magdalena is asking, how could the university and the business work together better for a greener future?
Well, this is an interesting question. The university and business for a greener future. Definitely, like I have been talking through the presentations, I talked about finding solutions, innovating and finding solutions. Because what happens at the university, at least when I used to teach, we created a lot of new thought, new streams of thought, new solutions, and business also has research and development as well. So bringing these two together can actually find solutions for some of the challenges that we are finding in trying to deliver on sustainable development goals. So the partnership between universities, where there is a lot of knowledge, and businesses, where there is a lot of assets, both in terms of research and humans and experience, we can form a very good partnership that would create solutions for moving forward with the goals. And of course, business require to be part of decisions on what human capital is required for future businesses. So that is another area that businesses and universities need to partner to say, what are the jobs of the future? What do we need from this side so that we can start already creating them? We don't wait for the future to be here before we have the people who have to deliver on those jobs. So there is that, and it is urgent, especially that one is really urgent, looking at creating the capacity in order to deliver on the jobs for the future. Yes? Thank
you, and maybe last question. It comes from Plamena Ivanova. Could you give some advices or good practices as example for better cooperation between business and NGOs?
Yes. Business and NGOs, like I said in the beginning, in my presentation, we looked at corporate social responsibility. If you think about all those corporate social responsibility actions that we analyzed, they were done with business and the non-governmental sector. It was important because the non-governmental sector is very good at following, especially working with very vulnerable populations, working with communities on the ground to make change. Non-governmental organizations are also present in many places where businesses have their factories, have their companies functioning, and they're able to gather to help communities also absorb the information that comes out of some of the changes that businesses make as they enter into communities. So this relationship that allows them to generate data for each other, to inform, to show best practices, and to invest in communities, really a great way of partnering between business and non-governmental sector. Yeah, there is a lot that they can do together for sure.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you for all these inspiring minutes with you and your speech and answering the questions. Maybe we can find another way to answer all the other questions from the students.
Yes, please.
Yeah, maybe you can write some of the answers, but we will find out how.
Okay.
Thank you for being guest here at New Bulgarian University. It was an honor for us to have you here. Sorry that students could not join us physically, but I believe they are online and they are enjoying also this talk. And all the best to you and UNICEF in Bulgaria, taking care for the children all over the world.
Thank you so much, Justine, for having me, and thank you, students, and I hope we will meet face-to-face at some point when this all is over. Thank you.
Yeah, I also want to thank all the colleagues who did manage to do all this great event. Thank you as well. Thank you, everyone over there, and bye-bye.
Thank you.